Good evening. I'm Representative Peter Meijer from Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. As a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's program on the current humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Yemen is one of the Arab world's poorest countries, and outside the war in Ukraine, the site of the most active violent conflict today. According to the United Nations, since the resurgence of war in 2014, more than 233,000 have died, including 131,000 from indirect causes, such as a lack of food, health services, and infrastructure, making today's situation in Yemen one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Since the onset of the war in Ukraine, food prices in Yemen have increased by 150%, according to International Commission of the Red Cross. Ukraine single-handedly accounts for about 22% of Yemen's wheat imports, and the ongoing and illegal war by Russia is creating a near catastrophe in Yemen, as per the World Peace Foundation. Yemen has a population of nearly 30 million people, and it's estimated that there are now more than 17.4 million food insecure Yemenis. That means that more than half of the country's population is experiencing severe hunger. As if the conditions weren't bad enough, experts are predicting an additional 1.6 million Yemenis will experience food insecurity in the coming months. Prior to serving in Congress, I worked for Team Rubicon, a veteran-based disaster response organization. And while with Team Rubicon, I saw firsthand the devastating mental and physical impacts of extreme food insecurity in South Sudan. Any country or person in the position to help the men, women, and children who are starving in Yemen has a moral obligation to do something. Access to food is one of the most basic human rights. I want to thank the Zeckelman Holocaust Center for continuing to educate about the importance of supporting human rights both in America as well as around the world. And it's my pleasure now to introduce tonight's speaker, Gregory Johnsen. Gregory is currently a non-resident fellow at the Center for the Middle East at the Brookings Institution. And before that, he's been a Peace Corps volunteer in Jordan, Fulbright Fellow in Yemen, and a Fulbright Hays Fellow in Egypt. From 2016 to 2018, he served on the Yemen panel of experts for the UN Security Council. And in 2019, he served as the lead writer for the Syria Study Group. His writing on Yemen and terrorism has appeared in many outlets, including the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, and Foreign Policy. I'm pleased now to introduce Gregory Johnsen.
Thanks so much, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I know we have people from Michigan, from New Zealand and Scotland, and even from Yemen, I believe. So welcome. What I'm going to do tonight for about the next 30 or 40 minutes is talk about the war in Yemen, and I'm going to do this basically in 5 parts. So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of basically what I see as what's been taking place in Yemen, and then we'll walk through the war a little bit. We'll look at the Houthi side, we'll look at the anti-Houthi side, we'll see the impact that this war has had on civilians in Yemen. That's going to be the main body of the talk tonight. That's the second part. Then in the third part, we're going to look at where it is that we are now in 2022, almost 8 years after the war started. Then we'll talk about why we should care, why people who, for most of us, are outside of Yemen, aren't Yemenis, don't have family in Yemen, why should we care about something that's happening so far around the world? And then finally, we'll talk about what it is that we as concerned citizens can actually do about the situation in Yemen. So let me start by just sort of setting the table for us here this evening and talking about the war in Yemen. And I think from the outside, for those even with sort of a passing understanding of foreign affairs or of what's taking place in the Middle East or what's taking place in Russia and Ukraine, the conflict in Yemen can seem rather confusing. And that's because the conflict in Yemen is really confusing. We talk about it as one war, but I think it's most helpful to think about the war in Yemen as actually 3 separate but overlapping wars. So what I'm gonna try to do in the next minute or 2 is just sort of unravel those threads for us, look at each of these 3 wars in particular, and then we'll move on and talk about the conflict that's been happening since 2014. So the first of what I would call Yemen's 3 wars is the US-led war against terrorism. So most of us obviously remember September 11th. Some of us may also remember that in 2000, there was an attack on the USS Cole off the coast of Aden, off the coast of Yemen near Aden. And that was really what started both the USS Cole attack in 2000 as well as 9/11. That's what started the US drone strikes in Yemen. And those have been going on since 2002, the first drone strike that the US carried out in Yemen, in fact, outside of an active battlefield, was in Yemen in late 2002. So for the past 2 decades, the US has been carrying out these drone strikes in Yemen. It sort of waxed and waned. We're in a bit of a waning period at the moment, but that's a war that's taking place. The US is fighting al-Qaeda, the US is fighting ISIS in Yemen. So that's the longest running of Yemen's 3 wars, and that's currently taking place. The second war is what I would call a regional war. This is between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia obviously has troops in Yemen. Iran has some military advisors in Yemen. Iran is quite clearly, the UN panel that I served on for a couple of years demonstrated this, as well as subsequent panels as well for the UN, as well as outside investigators, that Iran is shipping ballistic missile components and other weapons to the Houthis in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. So there's this regional aspect to the war, this Saudi Arabia v. Iran, and fighting it out within Yemen in the context of Yemen. That's the second war. The third war is the local Yemeni civil war. And this has groups like the Houthis, this Iranian-backed group in the north. It has groups like the Southern Transitional Council, which is a group of southern separatists who would like to create an independent southern state, the internationally recognized government of Yemen, all the different Tariq Saleh's forces, all the different armed groups within Yemen. They make up the different actors that are taking place in the civil war. So think of it like you have the US-led war against al-Qaeda and ISIS, and then you have this regional rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then underneath all of that is this local civil war that's brewing. So when you think about 3 separate wars that have sort of overlapping borders and that tend to bleed into one another, you can see why it can be a little bit difficult to make sense of what's taking place in Yemen, because all these wars are happening simultaneously. So now I want to drill down and talk about the Saudi and Iranian war, as well as the local civil war, because that's really the war that has been going on since I would date the war to really the summer of 2014. And this is when the Houthi movement, they're a Zaidi Shia movement, so doctrinally distinct from the sort of 12 or Shias that we see in Iran, but still Shia group. They moved out of their home governorate in Yemen, in northern Yemen, a governorate by the name of Sada, moved down, eventually overran some military bases in the governorate just south of them in Amran, eventually went into Sanaa in September of 2014. That's the capital of Yemen. They eventually put the then internationally recognized president under house arrest. He resigned the presidency, and the Houthis basically, it was sort of a very silent coup. The US embassy eventually withdrew from Sanaa, as did most of the other Western and European countries. In February, however, in February of 2015, this Yemeni president, a man by the name of Abdu Rabu Mansour Hadi, escaped house arrest, made his way all the way down to Aden. So Sanaa is up in the northern highlands. He made it down to the southern coast into Aden, where he said that he had obviously been forced to resign under pressure from the Houthis. He rescinded his resignation, went to Saudi Arabia, asked for military help. And this is really in March of 2015, where most people in the West started paying attention to what was taking place in Yemen, because right at the end of March in 2015, this is when Saudi Arabia announced that they were going to take military action in Yemen. And I want to pause here just for a moment, because what Saudi Arabia did in March of 2015 was really interesting. At the time, Saudi officials were in Washington. They were talking to their counterparts. Most of them said this is a war that's going to take about 6 weeks. The Houthis are undermanned. They're this poorly armed militia. We think with just some airstrikes, we can get them out. The war will be over in 6 weeks. Obviously, that was in 2015. We're 7 years on from that. Yemen's going into it. The conflict's going into its 8th year, wildly off the mark with their predictions of how long the war would last. Saudi Arabia also did this very interesting thing. They were going to war in a country immediately south of them. So Saudi Arabia and Yemen obviously share a border. Saudi Arabia is launching military strikes on March 25th, 2015. Saudi Arabia announces the beginning of the war from Washington, D.C. at 7 p.m. local time, which is the middle of the night in Riyadh. So it's Saudi from the very beginning has needed U.S. support and has needed U.S. encouragement. And in fact, immediately after Saudi Arabia announced the beginning of the war in March of 2015, the United States, this is under the Obama administration, the United States set up what they called a joint logistics and intelligence cell that was going to be there in Riyadh. And for me, this was the United States' original sin in Yemen. That is, the U.S. signed up to be part of a war, or at least to support a war effort, in which they had no control over how the war was going to be prosecuted. Very early in the war, the Houthis had pushed all the way down south into Aden. Some UAE forces, along with Saudi airstrikes and local Yemeni forces, eventually pushed them back up north, basically to the border between North and South Yemen in a very cosmopolitan area known as Taz. And then the war started to basically get into this stalemate or basically stagnate. The battle lines began to harden. This is in the summer and fall of 2015. And at that point, Saudi Arabia had really three options on what they were going to do militarily. So Saudi Arabia could see that their 6-week time frame was obviously wildly optimistic. They weren't going to make that. So Saudi Arabia could decide to withdraw and basically let the Houthis declare victory. Saudi Arabia could insert ground troops for what would likely be a very long, a very bloody, intense guerrilla conflict with no guarantee of victory. Or Saudi Arabia could continue to do what they'd been doing for the first few months of the war, and that is carry out a number of airstrikes and hope that things changed on the ground. So when you look at it from that perspective, when you think of those three options, those three broadly speaking options that Saudi Arabia had in late 2015 and early 2016, you can see why it is that Saudi Arabia chose to just continue to carry out airstrikes. Now, the problem, of course, with the Saudi airstrikes was that Saudi was carrying out airstrikes, and U.S. reports from the time at the end of the Obama administration and even into the beginning of the Trump administration suggested that Saudi pilots either A, weren't trained, or B, were careless and didn't seem to care where their bombs were going, because the Saudi airstrikes were having a disproportionate impact on civilians there in Yemen. In fact, they were killing a number of civilians, particularly very, very early in the war. And in fact, at the end of the Obama administration, the U.S. was worried that prominent officials, including then Secretary of State Kerry, could be prosecuted for war crimes because the U.S. was, of course, selling weapons to Saudi Arabia that were then being used to carry out strikes within Yemen. The U.S. knew that these weapons were being used in a way that was inconsistent to prevent or at least minimize civilian casualties. At the time, the U.S. was carrying out mid-air refueling of Saudi warplanes and UAE warplanes on their way to Yemen to carry out bombing strikes. So the U.S. was instrumental in allowing some of those fighter planes to carry out their mission. Some of those missions resulted in unfortunately in the deaths of civilians there in Yemen. So right at the end of the Obama administration, the Obama team made a decision basically, and this is after a very prominent, I was in Saudi Arabia at the time when this happened, a prominent attack on a funeral hall where apparently Saudi Arabia had some intelligence that the former president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who joined the Houthis, was there. They carried out an airstrike. It killed well over 100 civilians, wounded close to 500, or at least a little over, depending on who exactly you talk to. The Obama administration decided that they were going to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalition. That decision was quickly reversed once the Trump administration came into power. At the same time, there on the ground in Yemen, what was taking place is that this anti-Houthi coalition. So you remember at the beginning of the talk, I discussed the three separate wars. So you have the Saudi-Iranian regional rivalry, and under that you have this local civil war, where basically the anti-Houthi coalition is this group of various armed groups that are held together only by a common enemy, only because they're all aligned against the Houthis. But many of these groups within what I would call the anti-Houthi coalition can't stand each other and dislike each other. And very early in the war, in 2016, we saw some of these cracks emerging within the anti-Houthi coalition. And in fact, one of the things that was done very early, and this is a story that comes up over and over again in international politics, is the president at the time, President Abdul Rabu Mansour Hadi, the individual we talked about earlier, who had escaped house arrest, rescinded his resignation, and then basically invited the Saudi-led coalition into the country. He was worried that peace talks, and so we're in April of 2016 at this point, President Hadi was worried that peace talks that were taking place in Kuwait would basically, that they would remove him from power, that he would be sort of a scapegoat. He would be sacrificed in order to get the Houthis and to sort of put the country back together again. He wanted to avoid that, so President Hadi fired his vice president at the time and brought in another vice president, a guy by the name of Ali Musa al-Ahmar, who he felt would be sort of unpalatable to the West and the international community, basically saying, if you remove me, this is who it is that you'll be stuck with. Once he did that, the vice president that he removed was quite close to the UAE. And by removing him, President Hadi, lost the trust of the UAE. And what the UAE started to do is it basically created a number of proxy groups on the ground there in Yemen. So groups like the Hadrami Elite Forces, or the Security Belt Forces, or the Giants Brigade. Some of you who follow Yemen closely may be familiar with these. The names are less important than the fact that all of these different proxy groups, and there are about 90,000 armed men at the end of the day, all of these different groups are technically fighting against the Houthis, and they're by and large Yemenis, but they're operating outside the command and control of the Yemeni government. And that created then a number of problems for Yemen in its prosecution of the war, primarily in 2017, when a group known as the Southern Transitional Council, which I alluded to a little bit earlier, when they were formed. And basically what happened is the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, decided that what they wanted was an independent southern state. And so they were fighting against the Houthis, but the Houthis were based in the north of the country, and the STC wanted an independent southern state. The STC was very close to the UAE. I apologize for all the acronyms. I know it can get a little confusing. But the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is close to the Southern Secessionist Group. And basically the UAE and the STC, now the STC has this standing military of about 90,000 armed men. And in 2018 and then in 2019, there are conflicts within the anti-Houthi coalition. So the internationally recognized government has a military. The Southern Transitional Council has a military. Both of these groups are fighting for control of Aden. And in fact, they did come into armed conflict, and the STC made a push. They took control of Aden, which is the southern port city, which had functioned basically as the temporary capital, and they took control of Aden. So now you have the internationally recognized president who lost his capital in 2014 when the Houthis take over in Sanaa. And now he's lost his temporary capital of Aden when the STC takes over. And the STC starts to push out through Abyan into Shebwa, moving east through Yemen out toward Amman. And it's in Shebwa, they're likely on their way to Hadramaut. And it's in Shebwa where this offensive breaks down, and the STC then starts to retreat back. And you have this very interesting situation in which UAE air fighter jets are actually firing on President Hadi and the internationally recognized government. So you have a situation where President Hadi has invited the United Arab Emirates into the country. And now in 2019, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is firing on President Hadi's military in order to protect their proxies, the Southern Transitional Council, as they retreat back into Aden. So I hope as this narrative is making clear, that the battle lines have fractured, these groups, these alliances have fractured and fragmented in Yemen. And by 2019, 2020, it's become a little bit of a mess. Add on to this, just to make it a little bit more complicated, as if the situation there wasn't difficult enough. President Hadi has split the central bank. So the central bank was headquartered in Sanaa. That was under Houthi control. President Hadi didn't like that. He was very worried about how the Houthis were manipulating the central bank. So he said, we're going to take the central bank out of Sanaa and we're going to put it into Aden. But what that did is it didn't create, at least immediately, two central banks. What it did is it broke the one functioning central bank. And so you had a central bank in Sanaa that's now not on the international system. And then you have a central bank in Aden in 2017, early 2017, late 2016, that basically isn't up and functioning. So instead of one central bank that's sort of working, now Yemen has no central banks. And what's developed as a direct result of that decision is that there are now two separate economies in Yemen. So there's an economy that's under the control of the Houthis up in the north, and there's a separate economy that's under the control of the internationally recognized government in the south. And that means that the Yemeni Real in the north is trading at a much different rate than the Yemeni Real in the south. So just as recently as the beginning of 2020, the Yemeni Real in Sanaa, just to give you a bit of a taste, is trading at about 600 to 1 against the dollar. And the Yemeni Real in Aden was trading at about 1,100, 1,200 to 1 against the dollar. Compare that to when the war started, when the Yemeni Real was 250 to 1 against the dollar. So this raises a situation where most people, when people talk about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, often you'll hear people say, there's food on the shelves, there's just no money to buy it. And this is one of the reasons for that, is that the purchasing power of the Yemeni Real has lost significant portions of its value over the past 8 years. So people's salaries have remained the same, but they're no longer able to afford the food that they once were. So I want to pause in the narrative right now to say that's what's happened sort of on the anti-Houthi side. Now I want to talk really briefly about what's taken place on the Houthi side and talk about what governance looks like on the Houthi side. Because one of the things that I would hope to impress upon everybody who's listening here tonight is that in a war like Yemen, there are no good guys. Everyone has blood on their hands. Everyone has created, has carried out human rights violations. In my view, as an investigator for the UN Security Council, people on both sides, on all sides, really. It's a little too simplistic to talk about just two sides, but people on all sides, actors on all sides, have carried out war crimes and should be held to account for this. That hasn't happened so far, but that's what's taking place, and we'll get into a little bit more of that here shortly. The Houthis are a group that I said is a Zaidi Shia group, started up in the north in Yemen. Just briefly as background, they fought 6 separate wars from 2004 to 2010 against then what was the central Yemeni government in Sanaa. Those wars were largely unsuccessful. They were successful only in the fact that the Houthis managed to survive and fight another day. But that history is important because I dated the beginning of this war to 2014. But for many of the Houthis, it's a war that's been going on almost constantly since 2004. So when you think of it that way, the Houthis have been fighting almost continually with a few short breaks for the past 18 years, so almost for 2 decades. So this is a group that's been tried, they've fought, they have survived by and large, at least as a group. And what we've seen take place, one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia went into Yemen in 2015, one of the at least stated reasons that then Defense Minister and soon Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said that Saudi Arabia needed to take this action, go to war in Yemen, was that Saudi Arabia wanted to prevent the rise of a Hezbollah-like Shia group on its southern border. That for Saudi Arabia was a bridge too far. They couldn't countenance that. So Saudi Arabia said, by doing this, by going to war against the Houthis, we'll make sure that Iran doesn't control another capital, basically saying we think the Houthis are a proxy for Iran. We think that if we allow them to have this silent coup in 2014, take control of Yemen, that it's just going to be a foothold for Iran in the Arabian Peninsula. Unfortunately for Saudi Arabia, that's turned into a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the longer this war has gone on in Yemen, beginning in 2014, if you buy my argument, beginning in 2015, when the Saudis first launched military strikes in Yemen, what's happened since then is that the Houthis have grown closer and closer and closer to Iran. So you can see this in the way, for instance, that the Houthis carried out missile strikes. So from the beginning of the war, from 2015, when Saudi Arabia is involved, to about May of 2017, the Houthis are firing basically modified Scud rockets that they took over from the Yemeni military stores when they took over Sanaa, and those are flying at about 300 kilometers or so. So they're going over the border into Saudi Arabia, but they certainly don't have the distance to reach Riyadh or to reach the UAE. What's happened since, however, and there was a market shift in May of 2017, is all of a sudden the Houthis started to get a different class of ballistic missiles, and they were now able to put together missiles that were then flying into, that could actually strike Riyadh. And so it's at that point that really we start to see the Iranian missile component showing up there in North Yemen and benefiting the Houthis. What the Houthis have done, initially they had an alliance with the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who'd been forced to step down in the Arab Spring as a result of the Arab Spring uprisings. The Houthis took full control in 2017 when they had a falling out with Saleh, and the Houthis then killed him. The Houthis have restructured government completely in the north. They put their stamp on it. They rule through a president, but their supreme leader, very much modeled to a certain degree, I would say, on the Iranian system. They have ruled with an iron fist in North Yemen. So in the same way, Saudi Arabia has used starvation as a weapon of war in Yemen. The Houthis have used sexual assault as a weapon of war in Yemen. The UAE, and this has, I think, been well documented by the Associated Press, which won a Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago for some of their reporting on Yemen. The UAE has tortured Yemenis in Yemen. The Houthis have tortured Yemenis in Yemen. The Houthis, one of the things that they like to do is dynamite houses of people who disagree with them. So this is a group that, in the same way that Saudi Arabia has carried out airstrikes that show a callous disregard for human life on the ground there in Yemen and have resulted in a number of civilian casualties, the Houthis, although it's been less documented because it's harder to get access and the U.S. is on the side of Saudi Arabia, which naturally draws more of the attention from U.S. journalists who are investigating some of these things, the Houthis have been just as reckless with regards to civilian lives there in Yemen. And in fact, this, to sort of go back to our chronological narrative, this put the Trump administration in a pretty difficult situation. They, at the end of the Trump administration, they made a decision to designate the Houthis as what the U.S. refers to as a foreign terrorist organization, or sometimes you'll hear it shortened to an FTO. The Trump administration made that decision. It went into effect on the last full day that the Trump administration was in office before the Biden administration came in. But what the FTO was set up to do, at least in the eyes of the officials in the Trump administration, was to say, look, the Houthis are acting as a terrorist organization. They are manipulating and weaponizing humanitarian aid, which is supposed to be non-political, that's going into the country to try to stave off starvation, to try to deal with some of these people who are food insecure, that's trying to help them. And what the Houthis are doing is they're taking this aid and they're basically using it to reward their allies, and they're withholding it from people who they think are not sufficiently loyal there in Yemen. So what it is that we propose, this we being the Trump administration, is that we just designate the Houthis as an FTO. But one of the one of the results of a decision like that is that once the US basically has this broad sanction, and there were already leaders within the Houthi movement who were under both US and UN Security Council resolution. So at the time, I think there was about 5 Houthi leaders. The sad thing, and I served for 2 years on the Yemen panel of experts at the UN Security Council. We were charged with monitoring the sanctions regime there in Yemen, writing statements of case on individuals who met the criteria to be designated for sanctions. One of the sad truths, and in Yemen, the sanctions basically are limited to an asset freeze and a travel ban. And most of the Houthis who are being sanctioned, A, they didn't travel abroad, and B, they didn't keep their money in international bank accounts. So the sanctions were basically reduced to a name and shame. So I think the US realized that and looked and said, well, look, these sanctions aren't having any sort of an impact on the Houthis. So what we need to do is have a broader sanction policy that will get at them. And that's the FTO, that's the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation. Unfortunately, what that meant is once the US imposes sanctions like that, then all the humanitarian organizations working in North Yemen basically have to freeze because they can't interact with the Houthis, who are now a terrorist group, or they will run afoul of US sanctions and get into a lot of trouble. And so basically, and this is the sad story that happens throughout Yemen, which is one group wants to harm another group, and the people who bear the brunt of that punishment are always the civilians who are caught in the middle. And so it was the Yemeni civilians who were living in Houthi-controlled territory who were really suffering under the FTO designation. The Biden administration lifted that after about a month. And once the Biden administration lifted that, and the Biden administration came into office, obviously, President Biden in the White House announced just yesterday that he was headed to Saudi Arabia to meet with Mohammed bin Salman. Biden, I think, quite famously has been in the newspaper the past couple of days on the campaign trail before he was president, called Saudi Arabia a pariah. So there was little redeeming social value in the Saudi royal family. So the White House has had to attempt to walk some of those back as President Biden prepares for this trip. But the Biden administration in the first year that it was in office really tried to put a lot of pressure on Saudi Arabia to end this war. But by doing that, what the U.S. effectively did is it had leverage on Saudi Arabia, certainly, and to a certain degree on the UAE, although the UAE had partially drawn down by that point. What it did by putting leverage on the Saudis, it was able to get the Saudis to make a few changes. But what that did in the zero-sum game like Yemen is it just opened up space for the Houthis. So what we saw in 2021 was the Houthis renewing this offensive that they had moving east out of Sanaa toward this area of Yemen known as Ma'rib, which is a governorate. And for the Houthis, this is really important because most of Yemen, we heard in the introduction that Yemen has about 30 million people. And that's true, but the vast majority of Yemen's natural resources are oil and gas fields. Yemen doesn't have anything like the oil and gas that Saudi or most of the other richer, wealthier Gulf countries have. But what little exports Yemen does have are all oil and gas, and they're located in Ma'rib, in Shabwa, and in Hadramaut. And so the Houthis know that in order to have any sort of an independent state in the north, they need some sort of an economic base. And that economic base is going to have to come from oil and gas. And that's why the Houthis are really so intent on taking Ma'rib. So throughout 2021, we saw the Houthis moving into Ma'rib, encroaching on Ma'rib, trying to take it. We saw the Houthis making a lot of gains there. And in fact, they made so many, unfortunately, I apologize, I don't have the map, but if you can imagine, Ma'rib is sort of in the center. Right below Ma'rib is Shabwa, and then there's the sea. And Ma'rib is in the north, and Shabwa is in the south. So as the Houthis were moving into Ma'rib in late 2021, what happened is that they also started taking a little bit of territory in Shabwa, 3 districts in northern Shabwa. And for the UAE, this was really a bridge too far, because if you think like a military planner, if the Houthis are able to take Marib and they get the oil and gas fields there, they basically just consolidate their hold over the north. But if they're able to take Shabwa, then what the Houthis do is they effectively split the south in two, and that makes the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, the group that we spoke about earlier as wanting an independent southern state, that makes their dream of an independent southern state a non-starter, because now the Houthis have Shabwa. They've cut out Hadramaut, which is where all the oil and gas is, from Aden, the temporary capital and what would likely be the capital of any sort of an independent southern state. So the UAE, who backs the STC, brings troops from the Red Sea coast over. They push the Houthis out back into Marib. In retaliation, the Houthis launch a couple of strikes in January, you may have heard of, in January of 2022, on the UAE, including one on the airport that killed 3 people there. And it's after that we've sort of, that's the end of the war narrative, if you will, or at least that brings us up to where we are now. So what's happened since then is pretty dramatic. In April, President Hadi, the guy who'd resigned 8 years earlier, then rescinded his resignation, he'd been living in exile in Saudi Arabia for most of the past 8 years. He announced rather dramatically at the beginning of April that he was stepping down, that he was turning the executive authority in Yemen over to an 8-man presidential leadership council. And the presidential leadership council, 4 of the members are from the north, 4 from the south, 4 are close to the Saudis, 4 are close to the Emiratis, the UAE. And this is clearly an attempt, and perhaps even a last-ditch attempt, to basically reinvigorate and reunify the anti-Houthi coalition and make some sort of a deal. So what's happened in Yemen is that at the beginning of April, there was a truce that was announced. That truce was it was supposed to be for 2 months. That truce was just extended. The Houthis and Saudis are talking again. And the Saudis are looking for a way out. This war has been disastrous for them from a PR perspective. It's been disastrous for them economically. But I think what most people are overlooking is the Houthis don't want to be part of the state in North Yemen. The Houthis want to be the Yemeni state. And so they're not about to give up at the bargaining table what it is that they feel they've won on the battlefield. And one of the other truths about the war in Yemen is that the longer this war has gone on, the more armed groups have popped up. Now, none of these armed groups have the strength, they don't have the guys, they don't have the guns to impose their will upon everybody else in the country, but almost all of these groups have enough guys and enough guns to act as a spoiler to any sort of a deal that they don't like. And the problem in Yemen is you have more and more armed groups coming up the longer this war goes on. And at the same time, Yemen's economic pie is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And so what that means is there's more groups, smaller and fewer pieces of the pie to go around, and which means that all of these various groups can act as a spoiler. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that's sort of the road that we're headed to in Yemen. I have just a couple of minutes left. I think I have 4 minutes left. And I just want to touch on why it is that we should care, at least for Americans, for Westerners, what's important coming out of Yemen. Why should we care about this conflict that's taking place at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula? And I think really there are 4 reasons. So one, the reason that we've known about for a long time, we haven't spent much time on them here tonight, but al-Qaeda and ISIS are both there in Yemen. The underwear bomber, this is the bomber that was on a plane bound for Detroit from Amsterdam on Christmas Day 2009. He was dispatched by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the group there in Yemen. That group is still active, much weaker now than they were a decade ago, but they're still there and they're still active. They could potentially rebound. That's one reason. The other reason is shipping lanes. Yemen sits right on the Red Sea, right on Bab el-Mandeb, which is the choke point that goes into the Red Sea. I think if the last 2 years have taught us anything, it's that what's happening in distant places in the globe can have a very significant and severe impact on our lives in the United States. the impact on global supply chains. We saw what happened when a large container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. The Houthis have put sea mines there along the Red Sea coast. If those blow up, or if insurance rates go through the roof for ships going through there, that price is obviously going to be passed down to consumers. Also in the Red Sea is a deteriorating oil tanker that has not been serviced in a number of years. This is the FSO Safer. And this ship is in desperate need because it's basically, there was a New Yorker article a couple months ago that did a very good job talking about this. It's basically a ticking time bomb. And if it were to spill, the spill would be about 5 times the size of the Exxon Valdez, for those of you who remember that from a few decades ago. And finally, the fourth reason that we should care is the humanitarian situation in Yemen. The UN refers to Yemen as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. One of the things that is often not said, but could very easily be said, is that it's the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and it's an entirely man-made humanitarian crisis. And then finally, what is it that we can do? So if you've listened to this talk, if you have questions, certainly we'll talk about that for the next 15 minutes or so. But what can you do? One, I would recommend educating. So educating yourselves, reading books, coming to talks like this, speaking. And then finally, the step after you educate yourself, because as we saw with the Biden administration, came into office really wanting to pressure the Saudis to end the war, but that pressure opened up space then for a Houthi offensive. So educating yourselves and then talking to representatives like your representative in your district who introduced us here tonight. So I think there are a number of steps that we can take about why we should care and then what we can do. So I'll end my remarks there, and I'm looking forward to a vibrant and vigorous discussion.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was certainly complicated and thought-provoking and interesting. Hi, everyone. I'm Eliza Tick. I'm the manager of museum education here at the Zekelman Holocaust Center. And I know I have a lot of questions that I want to ask you, as I'm sure so many in the audience do. So if anyone online has any questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. But I want to start off by asking you, Greg, how did you personally get involved in this work?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm from Nebraska, so it's obvious, I guess, that I would go to Yemen. No, I studied abroad as a junior semester abroad student at the American University of Cairo in 2000. And I read, when I was there, this fascinating book by a British Arabist named Tim McIntosh Smith. It's still the best book I've ever read on Yemen. It's called Yemen Travels in Dictionary Land. And it's travel literature. It's basically a cleverly disguised history of Yemen from some of its earliest times up until the 1990s. And Tim he's such a magnificent writer, and he has a way of telling a story and making you want to go and see these places. And so when I read that book, I couldn't wait to get to Yemen. And then thankfully, a few years later, I was able to get a fellowship, go and study. And then once you go, and as they say, once you chew a little bit of cot, then you never want to leave. And so I kept coming back to Yemen over and over again.
That's great. So I know you've mentioned, obviously, the humanitarian crises that are going on in Yemen. And I'm sure that one option, which is certainly not an easy option, is for people to leave. So can you talk a little bit about attempts that civilians are having leaving Yemen and what the obstacles are, and exploring that a little bit more?
Yeah, so one of the things that I neglected to talk about, and I appreciate the question because it gives me an opportunity to talk about it, is that Saudi Arabia has complete control of the skies within Yemen. And so what that means is that Saudi has effectively shut down the airport in Sanaa. So the airport under Houthi control, in fact, it just opened up at the end of May. There were some of the first civilian flights as part of this truce that was just announced at the beginning of April. But what that meant for most Yemenis is that those who had the means tried to get out, and many Yemenis have left. So you see large Yemeni diaspora communities in Cairo, in Istanbul, in places that they could. But for most Yemenis, they simply lack the means, they lack the ways to get out of the country. And even those needing medical attention couldn't fly. So if you were a Yemeni, say, living in Sanaa, so living under Houthi-controlled territory, you would have to make a very dangerous cross-country road trip, winding your way through territory controlled by multiple armed groups who had put checkpoints either all the way out to Hadramaut or in some cases to Aden in order to get a flight out. And that's, of course, only if you could afford it on your salary, which has lost, multiple times its value over the past few years. We saw, Saudi Arabia has a pretty good border protection, so you're not seeing people going over the border. What we're seeing in Yemen is a lot more IDPs, so people moving from Houthi-controlled territories into territory controlled by the internationally recognized government. There may at some point be a little bit of reverse movement, given the fact that the economic situation is, at least the Real has more value under the Houthi-controlled territory. So there's also some economic movement as well. But it's incredibly hard for people to get out of the country. You can't get over to Oman, by and large, with the exception of some people in Meijer and Socotra. You can't get into Saudi Arabia, and other than that, you have to either go by sea over to Djibouti or try to make this cross-country trip and then fly out, because you can't fly out of Sanaa.
That's tough. So I want to get into the some of the U.S. Content that you talked about. Jamie asked a question asking if you can explain some of the obstacles that have hindered American policymakers from effectively preventing atrocities in Yemen.
Yeah, so the U.S. has played a very interesting role in this. And so if you remember way back at the beginning of the talk, I said that Saudi Arabia announced the war from Washington, D.C., and then the U.S. immediately set up a joint logistics and intelligence cell. So from the very beginning, the U.S. was implicated on the Saudi side. So the U.S., and when I was at the UN, the U.S. representative would make this argument all the time that the U.S. is not a party to this conflict. And as a matter, I think legal scholars international legal scholars would, at least some of them, take issue with that claim, because the U.S. has in many cases, either through mid-air refuelings or through supplying, the U.S., there's a great New York Times, there's been several great New York Times as well as Washington Post articles on exactly this issue. And one in particular from a couple of years ago talks about a situation in which a Saudi jet is serviced by U.S. contractors that's using U.S. intelligence, that's using U.S. bombs, and the Saudis aren't touching any aspects of these, but they have the pilot and they've bought the plane and they've bought the bombs, and they're then going on the run, on a bombing run into Yemen. And so if the U.S. were to pull out completely and say, we're not going to service Saudi aircraft, we're not going to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, and this is something the Obama administration sold weapons to Saudi, the Trump administration sold weapons to Saudi, and the Biden administration has sold weapons to Saudi. So this is not a Republican-Democrat issue. This is something that the U.S. has done across parties and across administrations. If the U.S. were to say, we're not doing this, then that would have a significant impact on Saudi's ability to then wage and carry out war within Yemen. But then if you take it one step further, okay, if Saudi Arabia is unable to provide any sort of air cover to Yemeni and Saudi troops in a place like Marib, then what then is preventing the Houthis from taking over Marib? And then Iran and its allies with the Houthis are even stronger. The Houthis have a stronger base there in Yemen. And once the Houthis get the oil and gas fields, they're probably not going to give them up. And there's no way that you can really cobble Yemen back together at that point. So the U.S., because of, I think, initial, what I would call the original sin from the U.S., has put itself in a really bad situation that it's just never been able to get out of. And now the U.S. finds that it has leverage with one side, not with the other side, which means that it's not an effective partner in a military alliance because the U.S. says it's not a party to the conflict, but it's also not an effective mediator because it has no leverage with one of the major parties within the conflict.
So this is a question from Summer, who was asking if there's any hope that Southerners will restore their country and how.
Right. So It's really, I think it's really, really difficult. The South Yemen was independent after the British left. They were helped on their way with some fighting there in the late 60s. Southern Yemen was independent through much of the Cold War. But once the Cold War ended, South Yemen was in a really difficult economic situation. And in fact, that economic pressure really led to the unification of North and South Yemen in 1990, right at the end of the Cold War. South Yemen was heavily dependent upon subsidies and help from the Soviet Union. And once the Soviet Union collapsed, that was no longer available. The only socialist country in the Arab world, South Yemen was during the Cold War. And those realities still exist. And if anything, they're even worse. I don't think that Yemen can be put back together. I mean, think of Yemen basically as Humpty Dumpty after he had his great fall, and not the UN, not the EU, not the US. No one is going to be able to put Yemen back together again. And in all likelihood, the Houthis, just by possession, will maintain some degree of control over North Yemen. And then the question becomes, what does South Yemen look like? And is it a place where, it's only STC or it's only STC and the internationally recognized government? Or is it something where Tariq Saleh, who's, we didn't talk about much, but is a northerner who fought with the Houthis and is now aligned with the anti-Houthi coalition? You see some of these sides switching back and forth. Does South Yemen become just this anti-Houthi coalition sort of state or zone? And if it does, then you have a variety of different armed groups that are all sort of jockeying for position and jockeying for control. And that's really the worst of all worlds, because then you don't have any sort of a unified southern state. So I'm very pessimistic, unfortunately, that Yemen can be put back together as a single country. I'm not even quite sure that Yemen can be two countries. I think the future that we might be looking at, unfortunately, which is bad for civilians, bad for Yemenis, bad for US policy, bad for the region, is a situation where various armed groups hold sway in various parts of the country. And that becomes a problem for any number of reasons. Mostly the US has no partner it has no foreign country to sort of sit on the opposite side of the table and deal with bureaucratically. And that creates a real problem for civilians who don't know what the rule is going to be as they move from one territory to the next. So that's my very sad and very disappointing answer to that.
Which kind of leads into another question that a lot of people in the Q&A are wondering is, so where does this go? What's the future? Where is this headed? What kind of conclusions can there be?
Yeah, that's what people are hoping is basically that the various parties have exhausted themselves to the degree that they'll actually sit down and negotiate. Just getting the parties to agree to a truce is a major coup. The UN has had, I think they're on their fourth special envoy throughout the war. Most of them have not made very much progress. This one has made a little bit of progress. But a truce is one thing, but then coming to an agreement is something completely separate. So most people, the US special envoy, I think the Saudis, are willing for, say, the Houthis to have a seat within the government, but the Houthis don't want that. They say, we're the government in the north right now. Why would we give that up to become just part of a government where we wouldn't have the power that we do now? And so, unfortunately, I think we're still a long, long way away from any sort of a sustainable and long-term settlement to the conflict. I mean, the sad truth of the matter is that Yemeni civilians are paying an extraordinary cost for this war. But the military leaders for the various armed groups are largely insulated from the shortages to do with the war. It's not Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the head of the Houthi organization, who doesn't have enough food or medicine. It's not Tariq Saleh, who's unable to feed his family. It's not Idrus al-Zubaydi, the head of the STC, who's struggling to make ends meet. They're not the ones paying the price. And so I think until that happens, and there's also we didn't talk about it, but there's a very lucrative war economy, and there's a lot of people in Yemen who are profiting off the war. And until that war economy is sort of arrested, and until some of the pressure is moved from just being borne by the civilians in Yemen and starts to be felt by some of the political and military leaders, I don't think we're going to have any sort of a resolution that makes sense and works for everybody.
And so just to kind of give scope again, William had put in the question and answer also. Can you recap what some of the population numbers are of these various groups?
Sure. So Yemen sort of writ large is about 30 million people. It's hard to get most of the numbers for Yemen, as you can imagine, are pretty out of date. I can go through sort of some of the different groups if that's what the question was getting at.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. The North is generally more populous. And so pre-war, anywhere from about 60 to 70% of the population would live in the area that was controlled by the Houthis. Those numbers have changed a bit. So to give you a little bit of an example, pre-war, we've talked about Marib a couple of times. This is the governorate that has oil and gas that's directly east of Sanaa. Pre-war, it had probably about 400,000 people, and the population is well over 1.5 million now, largely IDPs that have moved from Houthi-controlled territory. And so we're talking about, at least 1 million plus that have moved into Marib over the course of the war. Other areas of the country, we've seen the same sort of thing. So you're starting to see IDPs in Hadramaut. You're seeing people in Hudaydah as well. Hudaydah is under Houthi-controlled territory, but the Houthis often see Hudaydah's on the Red Sea coast, so it's the port that the Houthis have. But most of the individuals who live in Hudaydah are not Zaydi Shia. They tend to be Shafi'i Sunni, and so the Houthis don't really consider them, even though they're under their control. Or live in areas under Houthi control, they aren't considered to be sort of the Houthis' base, if you will. And so what that means is then the Houthis can impose higher taxes, and they have done things like privatize the electricity in Hudaydah as a way of sort of creating an unofficial tax and reaping it from people outside of their base. I know that doesn't quite get to what the questioner was asking on population numbers, but think of the North as having about 2/3 of the population, the South is having about 1/3 of the population, and that shifted over the past few years during the war.
So going back to what you were talking about before with the UN, what prevents the UN from having dialogue between the North and South? This is a question that Summer again put in the chat.
Yeah, so the UN Special Envoy as well as the US Special Envoy, they both travel back and forth. They talk, in fact, the UN Special Envoy makes a number of trips to Sanaa. Houthi mediators travel to Oman. The problem in Yemen traditionally, and this goes back, decades, has never been getting different parties to sit down and talk. In fact, after the Arab Spring in Yemen, for 2 years, they had the National Dialogue Conference where all these different delegates from all around Yemen, representing youth and women and the Houthis and the government, all these different groups would sit down and talk. The problem has never been getting them inside the tent, so to speak. The problem has been getting them to agree to a deal and then implement that agreement. And that continues to be the problem in Yemen. So the Houthis, there's just a Reuters story, I think yesterday or today, that talks about the Houthis in Saudi Arabia having virtual direct talks back and forth with one another. The UN Special Envoy is going back and forth and is bringing messages, trying to strengthen this truce as much as possible. So the problem isn't the communication. The problem is they just have diametrically opposed views. And as we've seen over the past 8 years, both sides have the military power to at least make sure the other side can't win.
So what, we talk about here at the Holocaust Center a lot is the impact that this has on humans and individual people living their lives in a conflict zone. So are there places where we can give money to Doctors Without Borders or anything like that to help with children or other civilians? Where can we direct some of our efforts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Doctors Without Borders is a great organization. The Norwegian Refugee Council, I know, works on the ground in Yemen. Many of these organizations I'm not, I don't have direct contact to. USAID is doing work, is attempting to do work. A lot of this funding goes through the UN as well. And Yemen is a country that I think the UN had a donor conference a few months ago and was asking for 4+ billion, and it got, I think, roughly a quarter of that. And so Yemen is always dramatically underfunded when it comes to humanitarian aid, and unfortunately, with what's happening in Ukraine, wheat prices going up, food prices going up, it's going to be even harder to contain the impact on civilians there in Yemen.
So I want to thank you, Greg, so much for speaking with us about this really important topic tonight. It was really enlightening and informative. I want to thank our program supporters, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, Gary Cappy, Barbara and Edward Klarman, Stuart Shear, Sarah Geyer and Scott Strauss, and Stacy and Mark Wittenberg. We're so grateful for your support. And a special thank you to our community partners, the Yemeni Honorary Consulate in Detroit and the Tulsky Center for Human Rights of Women and Children at Michigan State University. Our next event is on July 14th. It's a virtual cooking class with Becca Gallick-Mitchell. Becca is a third-generation Holocaust educator and runs the website Instagramma's Kitchen. She'll share stories about her grandmother, who's a Holocaust survivor, while teaching us how to make a special recipe that was handed down from her great-grandmother. To learn more, you can visit the Zeckelman Holocaust Center's website at holocaustcenter.org. Thank you all so much for joining, and have a good night.